Is there a certified medical professional on board? The question hung in the jet fuel-infused air as we were taxiing for takeoff on a recent flight. I had just settled in with my noise-canceling headphones, my psychology chapter pulled up on my phone, and my notebook and pen. I was relieved to catch up on studying after an exciting medical conference. I heard a flight attendant bell ding, and then another. In that moment I paused as conflicting thoughts raced through my mind. Knowing I had only one answer for me, I reached up and pressed my call button too. In the aftermath, I reflected on what made me pause and the conflicting emotions I had for helping someone. Why was there ever a doubt that I would help? Have you been in a similar circumstance? I know I'm not alone in this. Keep listening to hear more. Find the full transcript and more resources for physician moms at inspiredmommds.com/17. You're listening to Inspired Mom MDs with host Cindy Van Prague, helping physician moms take back control and prioritize what matters most so they thrive in private practice and at home. The flight attendant came to tell me there was an unresponsive passenger and that one person had already gone up to help. This is right up my alley as an anesthesiologist to assess levels of consciousness and all the reasons that someone may not wake up. I carefully laid down my phone, my earbuds, and notebook and climbed over the gentleman sleeping next to me. Thankfully, the unresponsive passenger was in a bulkhead seat, and they had cleared the two adjoining seats. Sitting next to him was a young woman who identified herself as a resident. I stood in front of him and did a quick assessment of breathing and pulse and a look at his pupils. I could tell he had enough oxygen, his respiratory rate was normal, his pulse was a little weak, but we just couldn't wake him. The other person who rang the call bell did come up, but I realized that she knew him and can't really attribute her behavior to being a medical professional in that moment, more like an angry acquaintance. In a slow unfolding of events, I got a manual blood pressure with the $10 stethoscope as the acquaintance asked for Narcan, which he didn't need in my opinion, but I was disappointed to learn that it's not included in the airline medical kit. I gave him a few sternal rubs and he popped open his eyes. For anyone listening who's not in medicine, when you put your hand in a fist and you rub your knuckles on your breastbone hard, it hurts. To not respond to that is very telling and not a good situation. But he did respond, and quickly, and he admitted that he was intoxicated. It was something other than alcohol, as I didn't even smell any of that. He was now coherent, and he was answering my questions appropriately. The resident, bless her, started in with asking him a full medical history. At that point, I tapped out and I went back to my seat. The flight crew determined that he was not fit to fly, so we had to return to the gate, and there were rounds of police and paramedics and more crew that came to talk to that passenger, and in the end, he stayed. After an hour-and-a-half delay, we finally took off. What I want to talk about today are the conflicting emotions, feelings, and thoughts that arise in this type of situation. Why did I begrudgingly get up to assist? Why didn't I urgently stand up to help? Well, there are a few answers to this. Practically speaking, I've eagerly helped on previous flights in a medical emergency. And I realize the full scope of how little we can do as a physician on a plane with a woefully dismal medical kit and minimal space to lay a passenger supine, even to do CPR. And then there are those feelings and motivations behind my behavior, and those of the resident and the acquaintance. What a stark contrast between the three people responding. The resident employed her training to assess the cause of being unresponsive. I used my experience to assess vitals and wake him up. The third respondent likely had some background information on the drugs he did consume. My compassion tank is nearly empty, even with stepping back to part-time in my job. Motivations change as we progress in our career for those of us experiencing burnout. It's interesting that the psychology chapters I was reviewing was covering different motivations that people experience for helping others. I believe these motivations evolve as one's medical career progresses. There are three that I would like to discuss and maybe a fit for you, depending on the situation, of course. The first is pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior acts to help others, such as comforting or cooperating to further the welfare of other people. It's straightforward, and thankfully, many people exhibit pro-social behavior that keeps society more livable. When someone opens the door for me or lets me in traffic or smiles and says thank you or hello, my day gets a little better, and it motivates me to pay it forward with small acts of kindness. It's interesting that pro-social behavior does not need to have a self-sacrifice component. That would make it altruism. Now, altruism is also helping others, but without regard for self-interest. You sacrifice time, resources, or energy purely to help someone in need. You may think of a philanthropist who donates anonymously, or a woman who darts into traffic to save a child from getting struck by a car. It's a raw, instinctual motivation to help. Some do argue that altruism isn't completely pure, as most of those who do help will get some form of accolades. I received a heartfelt thank you from the flight attendant, which I'm not going to lie, made me feel good. I felt good for following my integrity and contributing to a positive outcome, which for that passenger was not getting hauled off on a stretcher that day. I'd also like to think we made it off the ground a little faster since he was allowed to stay, and maybe some of the people on my flight made a connection here in Houston. Who knows, but the positive ripple effect made me feel good anyway. So yes, altruism is a form of pro-social behavior, but a very different concept. Finally, compassion is a third form of motivation that I want to mention. After thinking about why I was hesitant to help on that plane, I realized it was probably a form of compassion fatigue. Compassion is the emotional response we have to the suffering of others. I didn't immediately feel empathy and concern when hearing someone was unconscious, and that surprised me. I felt more immune to the possible distress of a stranger I had not laid eyes on yet. I heard 2 call bells indicating 2 other people on board responding to help. And I thought, really, do they still need me too? This reminds me of a famous social psychology case that you probably heard about. On March 13th in 1964, Kitty Genovese, if I'm saying her name right, a 28-year-old woman was attacked outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. Now, the New York Times portrayed a scenario where dozens of people watched passively as this murder unfolded. That sparked outrage and led social psychologists to research the phenomenon we now know as the bystander effect. This describes how people are less likely to intervene in an emergency the more bystanders are present. I kind of wonder if I paused to stand up because of this well-studied and proven effect, with 2 call bells rung before mine. I personally think that compassion, along with integrity and moral consciousness, helps me to step up and help. But I was missing some of that compassion component. My tank of compassion is nowhere near the level it was my first day of medical school. And then when I started my first rotation in residency, remember the excitement to finally practice medicine? It was such an honor and so humbling. I saw this in the resident that day, in her enthusiasm for a thorough history and working through a long differential diagnosis. Observing her demeanor and kindness, her compassion tank was overflowing. That used to be me. Well, it is to a small degree. Not that I believe physicians should maintain that level their whole career, but I have met a few mom docs who do, and those women are inspiring. You can also check out my previous podcast, episode number 12. It talks about compassion in depth. It's titled A First Step to Rekindle Compassion in Medicine for a Physician Mom. There's a link in the show notes. In conclusion today, I mentioned I've responded to in-flight emergencies in the past. One time when I jumped up more quickly than this recent event, I helped a gentleman who was struggling to breathe. We worked through it and the flight continued. He did okay. And as I climbed back into my seat, I faced the two passengers behind me. They said with a slight laugh, "Thank God you responded. We didn't want to. We're two psychiatrists." So I completely honor their decision, both then and now, after many years. I'm inclined to think by their response, they would have stood up to help if I hadn't first. It's what physicians do. Even though motivations may change a bit in life, you still stand up, you still help people. It's time to take control and thrive. Thank you for tuning in to Inspired Mom MDs. Please share with other physician moms and leave a review if you found value from this podcast.